Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. Have you heard of the law of the fish, or what we call Matsya Nyaya in India? It's a universal political theory, you could call it. In simple words, it means the big fish eat the small fish. That is the law of the fish. Today, 10 tiny Pacific Island nations defeated this concept. They stood up to a big fish called China, aka the dragon. These 10 countries rejected a Chinese proposal, a proposal China was so sure about that it sent its foreign minister with a pre-drafted deal. Unfortunately for them, it did not sail. These countries turned him away. And this is a very important story. One, because the Pacific is the new battleground, the new theatre for China's rivalry with the West. And two, because here's a lesson for bigger countries, the ones who willingly walk into China's death trap and let Beijing dictate the terms of engagement. This story is a lesson to all of them on how to stand up for one's sovereignty, even against a player as formidable as China. On Gravitas tonight, we'll discuss. We start tonight with a story that we're very happy to report, a story of small island nations standing up to China, tiny Pacific countries rebuffing the dragon. It's an incredible story and rare too. You see, smaller countries do not usually do this. They're vulnerable, they need money, they end up as vassal states. Making a compromise becomes their survival tactic. But not in this case. China came knocking on their doors and they turned it away. Let me start from the beginning. In fact, we've been telling you about this all of last week. We told you how China was targeting the Pacific, how China wanted a security pact with 10 Pacific islands. In fact, China was so confident of having its way that it went with a pre-drafted deal. Guess what? It has been given a royal snub. The deal is off. And Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, will return home empty-handed. For this, the Pacific nations deserve a round of applause because saying no to China is never easy. And even now, the threat for them is not over because China will try through some other means to gain a foothold. But why is China targeting these countries? What is its game plan? And what happens next in this story? On Gravitas tonight, we'll discuss all of it. First, let's tell you about what happened today. Wang Yi was in Fiji. He was hosting a virtual meeting with 10 Pacific countries. The Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, the Cook Islands, Niue, and the Federated States of Micronesia. All of these countries, the leaders of all these 10 countries attended. Before today's meeting, Xi Jinping had sent a message to all of them. It said China would be a good brother to the region. Small problem. China has been a bad brother to way too many countries for the Pacific Islands to trust it. They saw through the motives. What was China asking for? A confidential security pact. Here's what they wanted, basically. To train the local police in Pacific countries, to get involved in cyber security issues, to expand political ties with these countries, to conduct sensitive marine mapping, and to gain access to natural resources on land and water. China wanted all of it. This is what it meant by the controversial confidential security deal. It went on to become controversial. So these were China's demands. What was it offering in return? Well, China was offering money, and a lot of it. Millions of dollars in financial assistance, training for police officers in the Pacific, projects to map the ocean and increase law enforcement cooperation. What was in it for China? Strategic influence. China wanted the Pacific to be its turf. It wanted to replace the West. to become the net provider of security to the region. Unfortunately for Beijing, the draft of this confidential pact was leaked. And it created quite a storm. A tug of war began. The West was alarmed. Australia launched a diplomatic mission. Less than a week after taking office, Australia's new Foreign Secretary Penny Wong rushed to Fiji. The United States too swung into action. Washington struck a deal with Fiji. It made Fiji a part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IPEF. The same one that was launched last week during the Quad Summit. You might remember that. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was part of this launch, IPEF. This forum is being seen as an alternative to China's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. So first the leak, then the Western Charm offensive. The deal began to fall apart. And all of this happened even before Wang Yi had arrived in the Pacific. Once he did try to contain the damage.
My advice for those people is that don't be too anxious and don't be too nervous, because the common development and prosperity of China and all the other developing countries would only mean greater harmony, greater justice and greater progress of the whole world.
Don't be too anxious, he said. The appeal did not work, though. The Pacific countries took a stand. Micronesia led the charge. It warned Pacific nations against signing the pact. Palau took a stand too. Last year, its president, Surangel Whips Jr., refused to take calls from Beijing. Whips believes wide-ranging ties with China could be harmful. Fiji's leader, Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, told the press that there was no consensus.
China is a forum dialogue partner in the Pacific Islands Forum and is also an important bilateral partner to the 10 Pacific Island countries that met today. As always, we put consensus first.
Well, that's how China's pact collapsed. Beijing thought it was a done deal, but Wang Yi's assurances failed to convince the Pacific. The world was watching today's meeting in Fiji, so a sizable number of journalists were also present to cover it. Soon after the talks were over, they rushed to the Chinese ambassador to Fiji, and they all had the same question. Why had the talks failed? Listen to China's response.
There has been general support from the countries of 10 countries which we have diplomatic relations. But there are some, of course, there are some concerns on some specific issues. And we have agreed that these two documents will be discussed afterwards, and until we have reached an agreement.
Well, this is what total humiliation sounds like. China's bid to influence the Pacific has failed, and how. Wang Yi did sign some smaller deals. He still wants to chase that security pact, but the writing is on the wall for China. Nobody wants their friend requests. These Pacific nations have shown some bigger powers, how a country's sovereignty can and must be protected. So China's Pacific project is not going too well. What about the Himalayan one? One country is key to China's expansionist plans in South Asia. That country is Nepal. Historically, China has had little influence in Kathmandu. Their preferred partner was India. Just think of all the common links: religion, culture, trade, history. The relations are less diplomatic and more of a brotherhood, India and Nepal. But even brothers squabble. Right now, India and Nepal are locked in a border dispute. 3 territories are in question: Limpi, Adura, Lipu Lake and Kalapani. But India and Nepal claim these territories as their own. Now, this squabble is not new. Since the late 1990s, Nepalese leaders have repeatedly rigged up the border issue. One man takes the cake, though. Former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli. He published a new map of Nepal in 2019. It showed these 3 disputed areas as part of Nepal. Oli's tenure nearly derailed India-Nepal ties. He cozied up to China. He accused India of spreading COVID-19 to Nepal. It was all kinds of propaganda. But now KP Sharma Oli is gone. There is a new government in Nepal, one that promised to reset relations with India. And how's that going? In April, the new Prime Minister, Sher Bahadur Deuba, visited India. He met Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He offered prayers at the Kashi temple. Basically, he ticked the important boxes: diplomacy and culture. The next month, Prime Minister Modi travelled to Nepal. He visited the birthplace of Buddha in Lumbini. And there the Indian Prime Minister made an important statement. India-Nepal ties are as ancient as the ocean and as stable as the Himalayas. Does Nepal agree with this? The new government does want a reset in ties, but the disputed territories remain an issue. Here's what the Nepalese Prime Minister said on Sunday.
The government of Nepal is always ready to defend its territories. The areas of Limpiadhura, Lipu Lake and Kalapani are Nepalese, and the government of Nepal has firm understanding about it. The issue of border is sensitive, and we understand that these issues can be resolved through dialogues and talks through diplomatic channels.
Strong words there. Deoba is talking about defending the disputed land. And that language is very important, the use of the word defending. You don't have to defend against partners, especially not a long-standing one like India. So on this issue, Deoba is following the Oli playbook. Maybe not as aggressive, but the message is the same. The question is why? Why is Nepal's leadership antagonizing their most important friend? And the answer is politics. The Nepalese have certain perceptions about India, wrong but strong perceptions. That India is undermining Nepal's sovereignty, that India is sort of like the big brother. And Nepal's leaders capitalize on these sentiments. Oli did the same in 2019, Deoba is doing it in 2022. It is more political than strategic. If you're tough on India, the people will support you. That's the consensus, so that's what leaders do. But with China, things are different. Let me tell you about Mao Zedong's dream for Tibet. He said Tibet had 5 fingers: Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Bhutan, and finally Nepal. Mao said these 5 regions had to be liberated, in which case Nepal will have to defend itself, really defend itself, not against India but against China. Reports say China has encroached on 36 hectares of Nepalese land. It's a small country, so 36 hectares is important. Their constructions in Tibet are also altering the landscape. For example, some rivers are changing course. And when rivers shift, so do borders. In May 2020, China made another claim. This one was beyond belief. Chinese state media claimed that Mount Everest was part of China, literally a Himalayan insult. The Nepalese public was seething at Beijing, but their government was more cautious. Certainly no statements on defending the Everest. In fact, the very next month, Nepal supported China at the United Nations. The UN was voting on China's crackdown in Hong Kong. 53 nations supported China. Among them was Nepal. What explains this difference in attitude? Why are Nepalese leaders soft on China but hard on India? Like I said, one reason is the politics. The China factor is not politically beneficial. If that changes in the future, so will Nepal's attitude. But by then, will it be too late? China invests nearly $268 million in Nepal every year, $268 million annually. That money is building bridges, making roads, creating power grids. I know it sounds great, but Chinese funds always come at a cost. Just look at Sri Lanka. So Nepal must be wary of this Chinese embrace. Their leaders are used to playing India against China or acting tough on India to gain votes. But that strategy is extremely risky. It could derail ties that have been built over centuries. So Prime Minister Deoba needs to tone down the rhetoric. He needs to focus on the reset. As for India, it's time to introspect. India prides itself on people-to-people relations in South Asia, whether it's Afghanistan, Nepal, Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. India's commitment has always been to the people, not the governments. And the best example of that was 2015. India came to Nepal's rescue during the devastating earthquake. And despite that, why is the perception not changing? Why do Nepalese citizens have misconceptions about India? Solving that must be India's priority. If not, Nepal's leaders will continue with the rhetoric. And there's more news from Nepal. In fact, the country has a history of air crashes. It probably has one of the most dangerous skies in the world. There have been 27 air crashes in Nepal in 30 years. On Sunday, they had their latest air disaster. A small plane carrying tourists from India, Japan and Germany went off the radar minutes after takeoff. Our next report tells you what happened next.
Around 10 a.m. local time, a small plane took off from Pokhara. It's a small tourist town some 200 kilometers west of Kathmandu. 22 people were on board. The plane was headed towards Jomsom. Travel time was 15 minutes. But it never landed. It was a twin-engine jet. On board were 4 Indians, 13 Nepalese citizens, 3 Japanese nationals, and 2 Germans. A day later, their bodies were pulled from the crash site. The plane went down near Lete Hill. There was nothing indicating the plane wasn't fit to fly, but experts say they saw this coming. Nepal has a checkered aviation history. It has seen 27 crashes in 30 years, 20 of them in the last decade alone. In 2019, a chopper crash killed 7 passengers. In 2018, a plane crash killed 51 people. In 2016, another Terra Air flight went down just 8 minutes after takeoff. In 2012, a flight crashed while trying to make an emergency landing. 19 people died. After every crash, the question asked is why? Why is Nepal so prone to air crashes? Blame treacherous topography, made worse by human carelessness. It's not easy to land a flight in Nepal. There's no established airway. Pilots must navigate keeping the mountains and weather in mind. The radar system is dated, meaning there is minimum assistance from ground. So everything depends on what the pilot can see from the cockpit. On a cloudy day, when visibility is poor, flying in Nepal becomes a challenge. There have been instances of planes entering a cloud, losing sight and hitting a mountaintop. Plus, the airstrips in Nepal are narrow. Tucked between mountains and dense forest, if not mountains, planes often end up hitting wild animals. There were at least 70 such hits in 2019, including all sorts of animals, from wild boars to porcupine. Nepal has 8 of the world's 14 highest mountains. It's a pilot's nightmare. The government hasn't helped. The country's only international airport has just one runway, meaning a flight coming into Kathmandu needs to circle over the airport for a considerably long time before being cleared for landing. All of these factors explain why just 14 countries currently operate flights to Nepal. Some 20 airline companies operate here. None boasts of a great safety record, and all are banned from flying into European airspace. Nepal's aviation sector also has questionable maintenance record. In May 2019, a Tara Air flight had to make an emergency landing after its cabin door opened mid-air. For now, Nepal's Civil Aviation Authority has launched an investigation into the weekend's crash. Experts say one of the reasons why crashes keep happening in Nepal is because lessons from crash investigations are never learned.
From one troubled neighbour to another, Pakistan has sent a delegation to India. They crossed over at the Wagah border on Sunday. Today they held talks with Indian officials in New Delhi. What did they talk about? The Indus Water Treaty. It was signed way back in 1960. This treaty decides how India and Pakistan share the Indus river waters. The last round of talks was held in Pakistan. So this time, the delegation came to India and politically does not have any significance because these talks are never disrupted. Just think about it. The treaty was signed in 1960 and since then, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars. Dozens of border incursions, infiltrations, terror attacks, but through all of it, this treaty survived. And frankly, it's a surprise. There have been 117 rounds of Indus water talks. This one, the one happening today, is the 118th edition. How has this treaty survived for 62 years? Because of 2 reasons. Number one, India's refusal to weaponize or politicize the Indus waters. India has an advantage that it refuses to use. And reason number 2, Pakistan's dependence on the shared water. Pakistan needs this treaty, so they will not violate it. And we'll explain why. But first, some basic facts. The Indus Water Treaty covers 6 rivers. India has full access to the three eastern ones, Satluj, Beas and Ravi. Pakistan has access to the three western rivers, Indus, Jhelum and Chenab. At the same time, India can also generate electricity from these western rivers. In other words, India can build dams, and Pakistan does have the right to object. And when that happens, when Pakistan objects, there must be a negotiated settlement. This is how the treaty works. Now, Pakistan cannot survive without this treaty. 80% of their agricultural fields depend on Indus waters. What's worse is that Pakistan cannot control it. The Indus originates somewhere near Tibet. It flows through Kashmir into Pakistan, and from here it empties into the Arabian Sea. That is the Indus trajectory. India is located higher up the stream, while Pakistan is located further down, meaning India controls the river flow into Pakistan. And that is a lot of strategic advantage. If India wants to, it can flood Pakistan. If India wants to, it can also trigger a drought in Pakistan, by turning off the taps and reducing the water flow. India can build infrastructure to do all of this. But India has not done any of it. And that's what we're discussing tonight. Why has India not used this advantage? What would be the consequences of such a move? Would it be legally sound? The answer to the last one, the legally sound one, is no. The Indus Water Treaty cannot be cancelled unilaterally. Let me tell you what it says. The provisions of this treaty shall continue in force until terminated by a duly ratified treaty concluded for that purpose between the two governments. In simpler words, it means cancellation requires both sides to agree, India and Pakistan. Having said that, India can still go ahead. Yes, it would violate the rules, but remember, we're talking about Pakistan. They don't believe in rules. They don't play by the rules. Cross-border terrorism and infiltration is breaking all the rules. So India is under no moral pressure to uphold this treaty. You see, all treaties are based on certain understandings, like sovereignty, like security. Pakistan has already violated all those understandings. So India's decision, if it chooses to walk out of the Indus Water Treaty, would be a response, not an escalation. But we doubt India will do that. Two reasons for that. Number one, such a move could affect India's global standing. India is seen as a responsible international player, not an unreliable partner that violates treaties. And number two, India has never initiated a war. There's no reason to believe that India will now start a water war with Pakistan. And beyond these two reasons, there's a third one, which is humanity. Floods and droughts affect ordinary citizens, in this case, the ordinary citizens of Pakistan. Their rulers will still live in luxury. The people will suffer. So no Indian government has taken this drastic step of causing a flood or a drought in Pakistan. Despite all the cross-border terrorism, all the anti-India activism, all the border incursions, India has never violated the Indus Water Treaty. It came quite close to doing so in 2016 after the Uri attack. India was rethinking the treaty, remember. The Indus water talks were also suspended. But in the end, New Delhi relented. And don't get me wrong, we're not saying that India must engineer droughts or floods in Pakistan, or that ordinary Pakistanis should suffer. We're talking about leveraging, not weaponizing. And these are two different things. Perhaps India can push for a renegotiation or add new terms to the existing treaty. Basically, utilize its strategic edge over the Indus River. Today's meeting suggests the opposite. India is 100% committed to the Indus Treaty, it said. The question is, how long will that commitment continue? Just like droughts affect ordinary Pakistanis, terrorism affects ordinary Indians. And for New Delhi, that must be priority number one. I'll end with the words of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2016. Blood and water cannot flow together. Think about it. Meanwhile, there's a wild claim circulating in Britain. This one's being attributed to the MI6, and it concerns the well-being of the Russian president. The claim is that Vladimir Putin has died and that the Kremlin is using his body double for public appearances. Here's a report.
These are the headquarters of MI6, Britain's foremost secret service agency. It collects human intelligence to support the UK's national security. Their latest report is shocking. MI6 says Vladimir Putin may already be dead. Yes, the bosses at this intel body say the Russian president is no more. Is this wishful thinking, a case of state propaganda, or a fact-based assertion? No one knows for sure, but the claims are going viral. They are making headlines in Britain. Here's what they say. The MI6 has told them. Putin is very ill, and when he dies, his death, it will be kept secret for weeks, if not months. There's also the possibility that he is already dead. It's impossible to know. It is believed that Putin has employed body doubles in the past when he has been unwell, and the Kremlin could be doing so now. So what are these assertions based on? If Putin is indeed dead, what caused it? The MI6 will not say. The British media will not stop guessing. Some say he had abdominal cancer. Others say he suffered from Parkinson's disease. Yet others claim it was the result of a surgery. Everyone seems to be adding to the speculation. On social media, MI6 agents are being called conspiracy theorists, given the number of times Putin has been declared dead. Many are questioning the state of British journalism. The Russian foreign minister has responded too. He has rejected all such media reports and ruled out any signs of ailment. This is what he told a French broadcaster. I don't think that sane people can see in this person signs of some kind of illness or ailment. You can watch him on screens, read and even listen to his speeches. I leave it to the conscience of those who spread such rumors. Now here's the thing. Putin's health and private life are taboo subjects in Russia. They are almost never discussed in public, forget being reported by the media. So when the West raises questions on his health, there is reason to be cynical, especially during wartime, when narratives can turn the tables. So these stories about Putin being dead could just be a bid to demoralize Russian troops. It's not for nothing that they say the first casualty of war is always the truth.
In Sri Lanka, it was another weekend of violent protests. Let me show you some pictures. This was the scene in Colombo on Saturday. It was the 50-day anniversary of the protests. Thousands of Sri Lankans flooded the streets. They were demanding the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe. The police responded with force. They used water cannons, tear gas and batons. Eventually, the protesters were driven away. But how long can this continue? How will this cycle of protests and crackdowns end? Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has an idea. He wants the protesting youth to join the government. Listen to this.
The youth are calling for a change in the existing system. They also want to know the current issues. Therefore, I propose to appoint 4 youth representatives to each of these 15 committees. One of them will be appointed by the Youth Parliament. The other 3 will be from the protesting groups and other activist groups.
At first glance, it makes sense. The youth are angry and protesting, so why not listen to their demands? Maybe some of their inputs may be valuable and could be used. The problem is the timing. Sri Lanka, you see, is going through its worst financial crisis since independence. And this situation calls for experts, for technocrats. Angry youngsters from the street may not be of much help. But in Sri Lanka, experts are in short supply. For example, no one wants to be the finance minister of the country. And without a finance minister, you cannot negotiate with the IMF. You cannot secure a bailout. So last week, they appointed a finance minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe. That's right. The Prime Minister has been saddled with the finance ministry as well. His first objective is to strike a deal with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Wickremesinghe is preparing an economic reforms package. If the IMF approves it, the bailout can go ahead. But if the IMF, in fact, needs assurances, in fact, let me tell you what their official statement says. Since Sri Lanka's public debt is assessed as unsustainable, approval by the executive board of an IMF-supported program for the country would require adequate assurances that debt sustainability will be restored. In other words, major reforms and strict austerity measures. That's what the IMF wants. Now, it was always on the cards. The question is, what does Sri Lanka do in the meantime? They're down to their last dollars. There is no money to import food and fuel. So until the IMF's check arrives, what is Sri Lanka's plan? Seek more bilateral help. That's what they plan to do. And on top of their bucket list is India. On Friday, Sri Lanka's High Commissioner to India met Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, and here's what they discussed. Funds to import essential goods and fuel. Balance of payment support. And if possible, a currency swap. That is what Sri Lanka is asking for. Now, Sri Lanka's central bank is already in talks with the Reserve Bank of India. Colombo is hoping for a swap facility of $1 billion. But India alone is not going to be enough. Sri Lanka needs other lenders to step up. China, for instance. In the last decade, China were eagerly lending to Sri Lanka. Now they're being cautious. Vikramasinghe says China has agreed to lend a few hundred millions. Those were his words, a few hundred millions. The problem is Sri Lanka needs billions, not millions. Right now the country is living day to day. Foreign assistance may keep the island afloat, but not for very long. Eventually, they need a bailout. And this is worrying Sri Lankan economists, because Sri Lanka has a strange fiscal policy. First sign of trouble, and they sell government assets. The new administration is proving to be no different. Vikramasinghe wants to privatize Sri Lankan airlines. He could offload other state assets too, like ports or airports, maybe even power grids. And this would be a bad idea for two reasons. Number one, key government assets and services will end up in private hands, so less accountability and higher costs. And number two, who will buy them? What if Chinese companies take over the Sri Lankan assets? That would be a strategic nightmare. So Prime Minister Ranil Vikramasinghe has his work cut out. He must negotiate with the IMF. He must appease the protesters. He must reform his government. And eventually he must reduce the powers of the executive presidency. That's a lot to do for one man. Our next story is from France. On the 28th of May, as Real Madrid and Liverpool clashed in the Champions League finals, football fans ran riot on the streets of Paris. They vandalized public property. They clashed with the French police. The question is why, and the answer depends on who you ask. The fans say they were roughed up by the police for no reasons. The police say the fans turned up without tickets. A war of words followed. The French authorities are furious, as are football clubs, the ones which are involved. The question is, why are football fans so violent? Here's a report.
Tear gas, pepper spray, clashes, violence. These are not scenes from a protest site. These are images from a victory celebration. The victory of Real Madrid over Liverpool.
What's going on? What is going on? I mean, what's he been told?
Absolutely shambolic. The French, their organisation and UEFA is just horrendous.
He lines him up. Has an opportunity to cross.
On the 28th of March, the Whites won the UEFA Champions League title.
That far post ball works magic.
They beat the Reds 1-0 in a match that started 37 minutes late. Why late? Thanks to both their fans. Most of them turned up ticketless. Some even came with fake tickets. Both kinds forced their way into the stadium. They fought with the police and vandalized public property, all in a bid to get inside. The cops too responded with a heavy hand.
I have never seen such disorganization around the Stade de France. It is not the first time that the Stade de France hosts large events. The Stade de France was built in Saint-Denis 24 years ago. It is the third Champions League final organized here. I have never seen such disorganization.
The madness went on for an hour. It subsided when the match began, only to flare up again as it ended. This time, out of joy, hundreds of rowdy fans, most of them shirtless, began confronting the cops. What for? Apparently for not letting them in earlier. High on their club's victory, they ran riot on the streets. Within minutes, the distraught Liverpool fans joined them. It's not clear why they became violent. Apparently, they took the anger of their loss out on the cops. The chaos lasted way beyond midnight. Such was the scale of the mayhem that French authorities had to organize an emergency meeting. The next morning, they were seen rushing to the sports ministry. In attendance were the French Interior Minister, the Paris police prefect, and a host of sports officials. They called the chaos a national embarrassment and pinned most of the blame on the Liverpool fans. Neither the club nor its players agree with this assessment. The Liverpool mayor says she's disgusted at the brutal treatment of the club's fans, and that it would be shameless to pin the blame on them. Liverpool defender Andy Robertson says the event was not well organized, and the way fans were treated was disgraceful. Now, here's the thing. Football fans are notorious for being rowdy. What unfolded in Paris is not an exception. So the question is, why are football fans violent? Experts point to the concept of identity fusion. That's an extreme form of social bonding that makes people consider the game a part of their identity, and fans of the game their brothers in arms. This makes them travel long distances, spend huge amounts of money, and exhibit visual symbols of allegiance to their team. For die-hard fans, these symbols could be anything. A tattoo of their favorite club, a fight with the fans of their rival team, or even taking on authorities after a bitter defeat. This explains the hooliganism. It doesn't justify it. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Let's also take a look at what else is making news across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
Relentless Russian shelling targeted the city of Severodonetsk in the Donbas region, destroying over 90% of its critical infrastructure as Russian forces edged towards the center of the eastern Ukrainian city. Nigeria's Disease Control Agency has said the country recorded 21 cases of monkeypox since the start of the year, one which was fatal. A Beijing man has landed thousands of his neighbors in quarantine after he ignored an order to stay at home and later tested positive for COVID-19, prompting a police investigation. Sudan's army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has lifted a state of emergency imposed since last year's military coup, appending a fragile transition following the 2019 ouster of President Omar al-Bashir. Colombian leftist leader Gustavo Petro has come out on top in the first round of the presidential election and will now face a surprise contender, businessman Rodolfo Hernandez, in a second round on June 19th. The death toll in Georgia's boat collision has now risen to 5 as rescuers have recovered 3 more bodies. The incident occurred after 2 vessels collided on a river in the southeastern part of the U.S. state of Georgia. The iconic Mona Lisa painting at the Louvre in Paris came under attack as a man tried to smash the bulletproof glass and then smeared cake on the surface, but the artwork was unharmed due to the protective glass encasing it. The death toll in the northeastern Brazil floods rose to 79 as search and rescue operations continued amid reports of dozens still missing. Sam Burns overturned a 7-shot deficit before beating world number 1 and Masters champion Scotty Scheffler at the Charles Schwab Challenge on the PGA Tour. Scheffler and Burns both finished at 9 under for the tournament, and Burns drained a 38-foot birdie on the first playoff hole to clinch his third title of the ongoing PGA Tour season. The Boston Celtics reached the NBA Finals for the first time in 12 years after beating Miami Heat 100-96 in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals. They will face Golden State Warriors in the NBA Finals. Jason Tatum won the Larry Bird Award after being named Eastern Conference Finals MVP.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.